The fluorescent lights hum at a frequency most people don't hear. Danielle Ross hears it. She's heard worse: the subsonic thrum of Black Hawk rotor blades, the oscillation of mortar rounds passing overhead, the electrical buzz of a defibrillator charging to 360 joules. The lights at Oak Creek Memorial are nothing. Just background noise in a place where people come to forget their bodies are fragile and temporary. She arrives at 6:41 a.m., 12 minutes before her shift officially begins. The parking lot smells like hot asphalt and diesel exhaust from the delivery trucks. Her car is a 2008 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles, reliable, forgettable, the kind of vehicle no one remembers 5 seconds after seeing it. She parks in the same spot every morning, row C, space 14, between a minivan and a pickup truck. Invisibility requires consistency. The ER doors slide open with a pneumatic hiss. She's been walking through these doors for 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not that she's counting. She's always counting. The break room smells like burnt coffee and the waxy paper of pastry boxes. Danielle sets her bag in the employee locker she's been assigned since week 2, locker number 43, bottom row, next to a unit that perpetually smells like spoiled yogurt. She changes into her scrubs with practiced efficiency, navy blue, generic, wrinkle-resistant, the kind that wash out and disappear into a sea of identical uniforms. Her name badge reads D. Ross, RN, just the initial, just the necessary information. 3 years at Oak Creek and nobody calls her Danielle. Most of the staff calls her nothing at all. Before she closes the locker, her fingers brush across the worn leather sitting on the bottom shelf. Combat boots. Desert tan. The seams are blood-stained despite the cleaning solvents she's tried: acetone, peroxide, bleach. Some stains are permanent. The laces are knotted militarist style, double wraps around the eyelets, tight enough to leave marks on skin if you wear them for 18 hours straight without stopping. She's done that many times. The rubber sole on the left boot is worn through at the heel where muscle memory made her press down with the same pressure, the same angle, the same rhythm for hundreds of insertions and extractions across 3 continents. She grips the locker door and slams it shut before anyone walks in. The sound echoes off the metal. She doesn't flinch. The nursing station at Oak Creek Memorial operates like a controlled burn, constant low-level chaos that never quite explodes but never fully resolves. Danielle takes her place at the triage desk and logs into the patient management system. Password: Tikrit 2004. She changes it every 90 days as required by hospital policy, but the route always stays the same. The administration doesn't know what that date means. They don't know that Tikrit is a city in Iraq where she stopped counting her own heartbeat sometime during the 2nd consecutive day of firefights. They don't know that she can't hear certain frequencies without her hand starting to shake. They don't know that the fluorescent lights at Oak Creek hum at 60 Hz, close enough to the warning tone of a proximity alarm that her nervous system registers it as danger. But her hands don't shake. Not in public. Not where anyone can see. At 7:15 a.m., she's placing an 4 on a 73-year-old with severe dehydration. The patient is anxious, trembling, actually, talking too fast about the hospital bill and whether her insurance covers overnight stays. Danielle's voice comes out steady and low: breathe in through your nose. The 4 takes about 30 seconds. Her hands move with a kind of precision that comes from practice measured in thousands of insertions. 20-gauge angiocath needle. Bevel up. 1 smooth motion. The plastic catheter slides into the basilic vein without resistance. She flushes it with normal saline and secures it with medical tape before the patient has finished her 2nd exhale. But when Danielle pulls away, she grips the edge of the 4 cart just slightly too tight. Her knuckles blanch white. A tremor runs through her hands, barely visible, the kind that only appears in still moments when there's no controlled chaos to absorb it. The patient notices. Most people don't see Danielle at all, but this woman, frightened and perceptive, notices that the nurse's hands are shaking. Danielle releases the cart and folds her hands in front of her. The vein collapsed slightly. That's normal. "You'll feel better in about 2 minutes once the fluids start running." Her voice remains steady. Professional. Unremarkable. The patient nods, reassured, and Danielle moves on. She doesn't look back. She doesn't have to. She's already catalogued the room, exits, oxygen outlet locations, crash cart position, distance to the nearest defibrillator. 14 feet, 3 inches. She measured it her first week and hasn't forgotten. Dr. Marcus Sterling arrives at 7:43 a.m. The air pressure in the ER changes when he enters, the way it changes before a thunderstorm rolls in. He's wearing a tailored grey suit that probably costs more than Danielle's monthly rent, and his watch, a Rolex Submariner, stainless steel with a date window, catches the fluorescent light as he waves his hand at a resident. The resident, a nervous woman named Dr. Chen, is holding a patient chart. She's been holding it for about 30 seconds too long, which means she's uncertain about something. "Move," Sterling says. It's not a request. It's not even a full sentence. Just one word, delivered with the weight of someone who has spent 15 years teaching people that his comfort is their primary responsibility. Dr. Chen moves. Danielle watches this happen from the triage station. She doesn't look away. People who look away are acknowledging weakness. She simply observes, the way a soldier observes terrain, categorizing information without judgment. Sterling is left-handed. He has a tan that suggests recent travel, Aruba, maybe, or the Caribbean, somewhere expensive. He's wearing cologne, something with notes of cedar and leather, the kind that announces itself before his body does. His wedding ring is a simple platinum band, which means either he's practical about jewelry or he's compensating for something with authority instead. Sterling sees her watching. For a moment, their eyes meet. His other color of winter, flat and opaque, like windows into rooms where nobody lives. He doesn't acknowledge her. People like Danielle don't merit acknowledgement. She's part of the infrastructure, a nurse, which means she's 3 tiers below him on the hospital hierarchy, less important than hospital policy and considerably less important than his golf handicap. He turns away and approaches the patient board, where the census for the morning is displayed in dry erase marker. 7 patients currently occupying beds. 3 waiting in the lobby. Ambulance en route with a 64-year-old experiencing chest pain, ETA for minutes. Sterling pulls a red marker from his coat pocket, an expensive Mont Blanc pen, probably cost $400, and begins circling names on the board. Not annotating. Not correcting. Circling. The aggressive red loops are aggressive, the way his movements are aggressive, not loud, but compressed, concentrated, the kind of intensity that doesn't need volume. He's marking territory. He's reminding everyone in a 6-foot radius that this ER is his domain, that patient protocols flow from his decisions, that the board is his canvas and every person on it is his assignment. Danielle returns her attention to the computer screen in front of her. The patient portal shows a new intake form being completed in the lobby. 51-year-old male, presenting with, the form is still processing, still loading. She'll see the full presentation in 4 seconds. She waits. She's patient. Patience is what got her through 3 deployments and what's keeping her invisible at Oak Creek Memorial. The form loads. Male, 51, presenting with multiple lacerations and abdominal contusion following motor vehicle accident on I-45. Driver of the second vehicle. Conscious and responsive but requires full assessment. Trauma alert. The ambulance is now 3 minutes out. Sterling hears the radio dispatch at the same moment Danielle does. The sound comes through the wall-mounted speaker in the ER, the crisp voice of the paramedic, professional and calm, delivering information in the structured format they've all memorized. The tone of his voice carries no inflection, just data, vital signs, injury pattern, time of incident, estimated arrival. Prep trauma 2, Sterling says, loud enough for everyone to hear, quiet enough that it's clearly a command. Not a suggestion. Not an instruction. An order that assumes immediate compliance. The ER responds. Residents move. Nurses check equipment. Someone starts calling the surgical team. The controlled burn becomes slightly less controlled, the way it does whenever trauma walks through the doors. Danielle stands and moves toward trauma 2 without being asked. This is her job. This is the invisible part of nursing that nobody discusses in administrative meetings, the part where you're already 3 steps ahead because you've learned to anticipate chaos before it announces itself. She's been doing this for so long that she doesn't have to think. Her hands know where to place the monitor leads. Her eyes know where the crash cart sits. Her body knows the geometry of the trauma bay, where to stand to avoid interfering with the physician's access to the patient while remaining close enough to hand him supplies before he asks for them. Sterling is already in the trauma bay, already preparing. He pulls on latex gloves with sharp, economical movements, one hand, then the other. No wasted motion. No hesitation. He's good at this part, the part where chaos becomes a problem to solve, where his authority actually translates into lives saved or lost depending on the next 60 seconds. Danielle has to respect that, even as she maintains her professional distance, her invisible competence, her 3-year record of being nobody special. O2 setup, Sterling says, this time to Danielle specifically. She's already opening the oxygen tubing. Monitor. She's already attaching the sticky pads to the patient's chest. For access. She's already selecting the appropriate gauge needle from the tray, already swabbing the antecubital vein, already sliding the catheter in with the kind of smooth, confident motion that belongs to someone who's done this thousands of times, not hundreds. Thousands. The 18-gauge catheter seats perfectly. No resistance. No second attempt. She secures it and flushes it while Sterling is still adjusting the patient's position on the trauma bed, still barking orders at the residents who've rushed in to assist. For about 7 seconds, everything moves in synchronization. Patient monitoring. Fluid administration. Assessment. The dance that's been choreographed by trauma protocols and repeated so many times that it's almost graceful. Almost. And then Danielle's hand trembles when she reaches for the blood pressure cuff. Just a fraction of a second. Just a small shake, the kind that happens when adrenaline meets muscle memory and remembers something else, something from Tikrit, something from a day when hands had to be steady because lives depended on it, and hands that trembled meant people died. Sterling doesn't notice. He's focused on the patient. He sees a medical problem. He doesn't see Danielle's hands. He doesn't see the thin layer of sweat on her upper lip, the way her pupils have dilated even though the trauma bay lights are bright. He doesn't see anything about her except what he needs to see, an RN who's marginally competent and infinitely replaceable. She recovers in 1.3 seconds. Her hand steady. Her breathing returns to baseline. The blood pressure cuff slides into place, and she activates the automatic inflation, watching the numbers climb, 128/76. Slightly elevated but acceptable for acute trauma. She makes eye contact with Sterling, professional, unremarkable, completely blank, and something in his face shifts. Not recognition. Not acknowledgement. Just the smallest recalibration of his attention as his brain confirms that she's performing adequately and therefore doesn't require further consideration. The ambulance arrives 6 minutes later. The trauma patient is rushed in with paramedics giving their handoff report, 49-year-old male, driver of the second vehicle, struck driver's side. Ejected from vehicle, approximately 15 feet. Unresponsive for roughly 90 seconds, now alert and oriented ×3. GCS score of 14. Suspected fractured ribs, possible pneumothorax based on decreased breath sounds on the right. Pulsus paradoxus present. We've got 2 large bore fours running normal saline wide open. Sterling nods, absorbing the information the way a strategic computer processes data. His hands move automatically to examine the patient while Danielle continues her work in the background, monitor adjustment, fluid management, equipment preparation for the next phase of treatment. She's so quiet that she's almost not there. She's so practiced that she's become part of the infrastructure. And that's exactly how she's planned it for 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. The shift progresses. By 11 a.m., The ER has cycled through 12 patients. Danielle has placed 9 full lines, assisted with 3 procedures, and remained utterly, completely invisible. She's heard 2 of the residents make jokes in the break room. She's watched Sterling criticize Dr. Chen's approach to a GI bleed. She's noted that he uses authority the way some people use cologne, constant application, expecting it to cover something underneath. At 2 p.m., she opens her locker again. The combat boots are still there, still waiting, still holding the weight of a person she stopped being more than a decade ago. She touches them, just fingers on leather, and then closes the door again. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days of touching worn leather and saying nothing. The fluorescent lights continue their 60 Hz hum. Danielle returns to work. The fluorescent lights continue their 60 Hz hum. Danielle returns to work. 2 hours later, the ambulance bay doors burst open with the percussion of a life arriving in pieces. A sedan had collided with a delivery truck on Interstate 45, and the paramedics wheeled Marcus Webb through the threshold at 3:51 p.m., his left leg immobilized, his right arm in a makeshift sling, his eyes wide with the particular terror of a deaf man in a hospital where nobody speaks his language. His wife Keisha ran alongside the stretcher, her hands moving frantically, signing words he couldn't quite follow because her panic was making her signs imprecise. "It's okay, baby, it's okay. They're going to help you, just stay calm." The ER staff converged in that organized chaos that looks like coordination but feels like drowning, nurses pulling vitals, residents calling for imaging, someone shouting for an EKG lead. Dr. Sterling pushed through the cluster, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Someone get an interpreter on the phone. We can't work like this." He turned to the resident. "I need a full secondary survey. Focused assessment. Move." Danielle had been charting vitals on a patient 2 beds over when she heard the signing request. Her hand stilled. Her jaw tightened once, then released. She set down her pen with deliberate precision and moved toward the trauma bay with the unhurried stride of someone who knows exactly what she's walking into. The other nurses didn't notice at first. They were too busy cutting away Marcus's shirt, checking for pneumothorax, pulling his history from his terrified wife. But Danielle did notice what nobody else saw. She noticed the scar tissue on Marcus's left shoulder. She noticed the way his eyes tracked movement in a pattern consistent with someone who'd learned to read danger in the milliseconds before it arrived. She positioned herself where he could see her face and began to sign. "You're safe. We're going to help you." Her hands moved with the fluency of someone who'd spent years in small rural clinics where hands were the primary language, where broken English and American Sign Language were the only bridges between aid workers and the survivors they pulled from rubble. Her fingers spelled out letters and shapes that Marcus's eyes followed like they were lifelines. "Can you tell us where it hurts?" His eyes widened. Not just relief, recognition. Something flickered across his face, a memory surfacing like a body pulled from dark water. His signing back was clumsy from the adrenaline, but urgent. "You. I know you. Tikrit. You pulled me out." Sterling noticed. He stepped toward Danielle, and the temperature in the room dropped exactly 3 degrees. "Nurse Ross, step back. This is physician territory." His voice was quiet now, which made it more dangerous. "You're a nurse. Not a translator. Not a doctor. Know your place." She continued signing to Marcus. "I'm going to ask the doctor to check your ribs now," and Sterling's voice rose, filling the space like floodwater. "I said step back, Florence Nightingale. You're overstepping. You're interfering with my initial assessment." He turned to the resident, his tone shifting to the measured authority of someone documenting a problem. "Chart that." Nurse Ross interfered with initial physician assessment. Unauthorized patient communication. The room went so quiet you could hear the 4 drip hitting the collection chamber. 1, 2, 3 drops. Keisha's eyes moved between Sterling and Danielle, confused, frightened, trying to understand why the kind nurse who was the only person her husband could understand was being called out. She opened her mouth to speak and closed it again, sensing the current of power that had just shifted. Sterling turned back to Marcus. You'll need imaging. Full body CT. We need to rule out internal bleeding, spinal injury, pneumothorax. He spoke to the resident, completely bypassing Danielle, as if she'd already become invisible. Get him upstairs. I'll review the scans in 30 minutes. They wheeled Marcus out. Danielle stepped back to her charting station. The other nurses avoided her eyes. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say. By 4:15 p.m., Sterling had called Danielle into the patient room where Marcus was being prepped for his CT scan. Keisha sat beside him, holding his hand. Sterling positioned himself at the foot of the bed, his posture the kind that makes people smaller just by proximity. Your job is to follow orders, he said, his voice level, conversational, which was somehow worse than yelling. Not to play hero. Not to perform duties outside your scope. You're a nurse, which means you take vital signs and follow physician directives. Do you understand how boundaries work, or do I need to draw you a picture? Danielle took one measured breath. The kind of breath that comes from deep muscle memory, from years of controlling your nervous system under fire. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from crying, but from the physical pressure of holding herself in place. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, without flinching, without giving him anything. When she spoke, her voice came out like still water, perfectly calm, perfectly steady. I was ensuring a patient received dignified care, which I understood to be our mission here. Sterling's jaw tightened. A muscle worked near his temple. He wasn't used to people who didn't break, who didn't defend, who didn't scramble. He was used to people who folded. My office. After your shift. The break room at 4:24 p.m. smelled like old coffee and microwave popcorn and the particular staleness of a space where people pretend to relax while doing nothing but thinking about work. Danielle opened her insulated lunch container, turkey sandwich, carrot sticks, an apple her 16-year-old son Caleb had selected because he was trying to get her to eat healthier. She sat at the table by the window where she usually sat, the one that faced the parking lot and the slice of Houston sky beyond. 3 nurses approached together, the way predators sometimes move. Not hostile, just coordinated. Elena, who'd laughed at Danielle's joke about the attending's tie last week. Rebecca, who'd borrowed Danielle's scrub top when hers tore on a piece of equipment. And Marcus, not the patient, but the male nurse who'd covered her break last Tuesday. They lined up at the refrigerator, deliberately not approaching Danielle's table. One of them, Elena, glanced over, mouthed sorry, and then turned away to sit with the afternoon shift residents instead. Danielle took a bite of her sandwich. The bread was slightly stale. She chewed it anyway, methodically, her hand steady, her eyes on the carrot stick she'd placed on the paper towel beside her container. Nobody approached. Nobody sat down. The message was clear. Whatever Sterling thought about Danielle Ross, it was contagious. By 3:53 p.m., Sterling had posted a notice on the unit board. It was printed on white paper with standard hospital policy headers, but the bottom half had been highlighted in bright red marker, the kind that looks like a warning sign or a wound. The text read, Policy Violations, D. Ross. Unauthorized patient communication, 1. Interference with physician assessment, 2. Exceeding nursing scope of practice, 3. Performing translator duties without credentialing, 4. Insubordination, 5. Formal review pending. Department Head, Dr. J. Sterling. Staff walked past throughout the afternoon, reading, processing, understanding what it meant. Nobody spoke to Danielle. Nobody met her eyes. The message was clear. Sterling had drawn a line, and on one side of it was safety, and on the other was Danielle. In the hallway near the supply closet, Sterling cornered her as she was restocking for kits. His voice was low, for her ears only, which somehow made it worse than if he'd screamed. Explain yourself. Why are you here? What's your angle? Because I've worked in hospitals for 23 years, and I know when someone's playing a role. Who are you? Danielle didn't look at him. She continued organizing the supplies with the same measured precision she brought to everything. I'm a nurse who wants to provide care. You're hiding something. Sterling stepped closer. And I'm going to find out what it is. She turned to face him then, and something in her eyes made him step backward involuntarily, not fear in his eyes, but recognition that he'd just looked at a depth he hadn't anticipated. She said nothing. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then she moved past him with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. By 5:08 p.m., Sterling was in his office with his door closed, his computer screen glowing in the dim Houston afternoon light. His finger hovered over his phone for approximately 45 seconds. Then he dialed. The connection took 3 rings. A voice answered, Patricia Donovan's office. It's James. We need to talk about a liability on my floor. A nurse. Danielle Ross. Something about her doesn't add up, and I need a credential review. Today, if possible. The voice on the other end, Patricia Donovan, board member, his brother-in-law's former colleague, said simply, I'll make some calls. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It started a machinery in motion that nobody could stop. The machinery Sterling set in motion moved with the precision of a predator closing in on wounded prey. Within the hour, he was in his office with the door closed, dialing Patricia Donovan, the hospital's board chair. His voice carried the weight of institutional concern, not anger, but something colder. Patricia, I need to flag something about one of my staff. Routine background verification. The nurse who assisted with that deaf patient this morning. He paused, letting the implication settle. There's a gap in her credentials. Nothing listed on the application. Military service, civilian experience, I need clarity before she's near patients again. By 4:19 p.m., he'd sent the same request to HR, marked urgent, requesting her complete personnel file for his routine staff review. By 5:15 p.m., an email landed in the inbox of the Texas Board of Nursing, bearing his signature and the weight of his title, department head. The email was surgical in its vagueness. I am writing to request a background investigation into nursing credentials for Danielle Ross, employed at our facility. Discrepancies in her application materials warrant formal review. Sterling sat at his desk that evening, the ER humming with the normal rhythm of Houston's Tuesday Night Wounded, and he pulled Danielle's file from HR. The manila folder was thin, just 3 years of employment records, shift rotations, performance reviews all marked satisfactory, nothing remarkable. Then he opened her original job application, dated September 2021. In the employment history section, under previous military service, the line was blank. No notation. No explanation. Just white space where something significant should have been. Sterling's jaw tightened. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. A blank space was a lie told through omission. He photographed the page with his phone and forwarded it to the state board with a new message, further documentation attached. Background verification recommended before licensure renewal. The machinery was moving. Sterling couldn't prove what she was hiding, but he didn't need to. He just needed to make sure everyone else was looking. At 9:07 p.m., Marcus Webb pressed his call button for the 3rd time in an hour, his free hand clutching his left side. His breathing had become shallow, each inhale a conscious effort. Keisha sat in the chair beside his bed, watching the heart monitor with the intensity of someone who knew that machines could lie while also being the only truth they had. "He's getting worse," she signed to the nursing assistant who came to check vitals. Marcus's oxygen saturation was 94%, borderline but acceptable. His heart rate had climbed to 108. Blood pressure was 136/82. Chest pressure, the nursing assistant asked, speaking slowly enough for Marcus to read lips. Marcus nodded, his hands moving in rapid signing. Right side. Like something's broken inside. The nursing assistant made a note and paged Dr. Raj Patel, the on-call resident, a second-year medicine resident who looked perpetually 5 minutes away from falling asleep. Patel arrived at Marcus's bedside wearing scrubs that hadn't been changed since 6 a.m., his stethoscope hanging like an anchor around his neck. He listened to Marcus's lungs, clear. He palpated his ribs, winced when Marcus flinched at the right side. He ordered observation. "Keep him on the monitor," Patel said, already backing toward the door. "Likely muscular inflammation from the accident. We'll reassess in the morning." Observation. The word carried the weight of medical surrender dressed up as patience. The hours between 9 p.m. and midnight stretched like a rubber band being pulled at both ends. Marcus's restlessness increased. His breathing became more labored, not more comfortable. At 10:43 p.m., Danielle came in for the night shift, and the charge nurse assigned her to room for 12 without fanfare, just another patient, another task in the machinery of care that moved through the hospital like blood through veins. Danielle had taken care of 1,000 patients since she'd started at Oak Creek Memorial 3 years ago. But when she stepped into Marcus's room and saw his face, the same face she'd pulled from rubble in Tikrit in 2004, older now, shaped by 2 decades of survival and deafness and the particular weight of being a man that nobody expected to make it, her hand steadied in a way that had nothing to do with professionalism. She was 3 years old when she first learned that some people couldn't be saved unless you moved. 37 years old, and nothing had changed. "Hey," she signed to him, her movements precise and unhurried. "How are you feeling?" Marcus's signs were slower than they'd been that morning, his energy diminishing like a phone losing battery. "Pain," he signed. "Worse." "Can't breathe right." Danielle glanced at the monitors. Heart rate 114. O2 sat 93. BP holding steady at 138/85. Normal parameters had become a lie. She reviewed his chart, found the admission CT scan notes. Right-sided rib fractures, noted. Grade 1 left lung contusion, noted. But nobody had connected those dots to what a rib fracture meant. It meant bone fragments. It meant shards of calcium and marrow moving inside a person like shrapnel. It meant that every breath, every heartbeat, every moment could be the one where something breaks through into the space it wasn't supposed to enter. At 11:15 p.m., Danielle asked for permission to order a chest X-ray, to repeat the EKG, to do something other than sit in the corridor and let a young man deteriorate in front of her. The night-charged nurse, a burnt-out nurse named Harris who'd been working at Oak Creek Memorial for 9 years and had learned not to push too hard, said, "The resident already assessed." He said observation. "Let's respect the attending's plan." The words were delivered with the flatness of someone who'd already fought too many battles and lost most of them. Sterling appeared at the unit desk at 11:27 p.m., summoned by an unrelated admission, a VIP patient from the mayor's office with chest pain, which meant Sterling was suddenly visible, suddenly present, suddenly blocking the hallway with his authority like a dam holding back water. He saw Danielle standing outside room for 12, still in her scrubs from the morning shift, looking at Marcus through the window. Her shift had ended at 3 p.m. It was now past midnight. "Nurse Ross," Sterling's voice cut through the quiet with the precision of a scalpel. "Why are you still here?" Danielle didn't turn immediately. When she did, her eyes were flat, her face a mask. "This patient needs monitoring." "He has monitoring," Sterling replied, his voice carrying the kind of edge that made other nurses suddenly find reasons to be elsewhere. "It's called a night shift. Your shift ended 9 hours ago. Go home before I write you up for unauthorized overtime." The words were delivered with the kind of certainty that made them feel like truth. Danielle closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, not trembling, not flinching, just processing the command from someone whose authority made her expendable and whose ignorance made him dangerous. "Yes, doctor," she said quietly, and she left. But she didn't drive home. She drove to the parking lot and sat in her 2008 Civic with the engine running, watching the ER entrance, watching the lights, watching the place where a man she'd known as a child was dying in slow motion while everyone around him called it observation. At 1:45 a.m., the alarm cut through the hospital like a blade. Not a casual alert, not a monitor notification, the full code alarm, the one that brought everyone running. Danielle heard it from the parking lot and didn't think. She moved. Her car was parked and she was moving toward the entrance in the time it took most people to process what they were hearing. The automatic doors opened like a mouth and she was inside, her hands already moving, her body already responding to the muscle memory that Sterling had no idea existed. Marcus's room was ablaze with light and activity. Dr. Patel stood frozen at the bedside, his hands trembling, his voice coming out in fragments. "We need cardiothoracic, we need the surgeon, we need." Marcus's blood pressure had bottomed out at 64/40. His heart rate had climbed to 142 and then dropped to 104 in an erratic rhythm that meant something was collapsing inside his chest cavity. Beck's triad, muffled heart sounds, elevated jugular venous pressure, hypertension, the classic presentation of cardiac tamponade, blood accumulating in the sac around his heart, pressing on it with each beat, squeezing the life out of it 1 millimeter at a time. A rib fragment. Just a small piece of calcium. It had traveled through muscle and tissue and found the thin membrane of the pericardium, and when it perforated that membrane, Marcus's heart had begun bleeding into its own sac. Danielle was in the room before anyone realized it. Her presence didn't announce itself. It simply appeared, like gravity, like something that had always been there and everyone was just now noticing it. "We need a pericardiocentesis now," her voice said, and it wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. It was a statement of fact delivered with the kind of certainty that made Patel's hands stop shaking just from hearing it. "Or he dies in 3 minutes. Patel's eyes went wider. "I've never done one. I can't." Danielle was already moving toward the crash cart, her hands reaching with the kind of precision that comes from having done the same motion 1,000 times under conditions that would have broken anyone less solid. She pulled an 18-gauge needle from the cart, held it up to the light, found a syringe. "Step aside," she said to Patel, and the voice that came out was the voice of someone who'd given orders on the other side of the world, who'd made life-and-death decisions that saved people nobody else even knew existed. It was the voice of Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, and it moved through the room like a command through a radio, impossible to ignore. Keisha had her hands pressed against her mouth. The nursing assistant stood frozen. The night shift RN who'd been running the code suddenly understood that the person who'd just given the command wasn't a floor nurse. The person who'd given that command was something else entirely. Danielle's hands moved to Marcus's chest, palpating the landmarks, finding the angle of Louis, counting down the ribs. Her fingers were steady. There was no tremor. There was only information and movement and the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst that the world could do. The needle was positioned at the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, at a 45-degree angle to the chest wall. She pushed through skin, through muscle, through the intercostal space, feeling the subtle give as the needle entered the pericardial sac. Blood flowed into the syringe like release. The hiss of tension leaving. Marcus's blood pressure climbed. 68/42. 72/45. 78/48. The pressure in the sac had dropped by exactly the amount needed to let his heart beat again. His oxygen saturation climbed. 93, 95. 97. The rhythm strip showed something approaching normal, the electrical chaos resolving into something almost beautiful in its regularity. The monitor's alarm cut through the silence like a blade. 2 o'clock in the morning. Marcus Webb's oxygen saturation plummeted from 94 to 87 to 79 in the span of 30 seconds. His blood pressure collapsed. 70/40. Then 60/30. The rib fragment that had seemed stable during Danielle's initial assessment had shifted, punctured deeper, torn through the pericardium. Blood was pooling around his heart. Cardiac tamponade. The pressure inside the sac was crushing the chambers, suffocating the organ from the outside. Dr. Raj Patel stood at the bedside, staring at the monitor as if the numbers might reverse if he looked long enough. His hands hung at his sides. He'd been awakened from the on-call room 15 minutes ago and had read the chart in fragments, half conscious, his mind still wrapped in sleep. Now the reality hit him, a complication he'd missed, a trajectory he hadn't monitored closely enough. The attending was 20 minutes away. The resident who'd initially admitted Marcus was already on another trauma. Patel was alone with a dying patient. Keisha Webb gripped the rail at the foot of her husband's bed, her body rigid with terror. Marcus couldn't hear the alarm, couldn't hear her whispers, but he could feel his own body failing. His eyes were wide. His hands clawed at the sheets. Danielle moved before anyone gave an order. She'd been checking the vitals from the monitor station, had caught the change in the waveform that meant something had shifted. She knew what was coming. More than that, her hands already knew what to do. 60 to 50. 45. The pressure kept falling. Patel's mouth opened. No words came. Danielle was already pulling the crash cart closer, already reaching for the sterile field, her movements precise and economical. She didn't ask permission. She didn't hesitate. The person Danielle Ross had been before she'd become a nurse, before she'd buried her military identity in combat boots and silence, that person woke up completely. I need an 18-gauge needle. Her voice was different now. Not the deferential whisper she'd used for 3 years. This was command voice. This was the tone that had moved soldiers through fire. Patel blinked at her. Now, doctor. He handed it to her. His hands were shaking. Hers weren't. Danielle prepped the site with betadine, her fingers landing on landmarks she hadn't consciously used since 2004. The xiphoid process. The angle. 20 years collapsed into muscle memory. She could feel the needle's weight, the resistance of skin, the subtle give of tissue. Pain is data, the training said. Every micron of resistance told a story. She angled the needle at 45 degrees toward the left shoulder, moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this in field conditions, in darkness, with incoming fire and a patient bleeding out on her lap. The needle advanced. 1 centimeter. 2. 3. Danielle's breath was controlled. Keisha was crying. Patel was frozen. The monitor continued its death song. 50. 42. The pericardial sac was under tension, the fluid inside pressing against Marcus's heart like a closed fist. The needle met resistance. Not tissue, fluid. Danielle felt the subtle pop as the needle pierced the pericardial membrane. She advanced the catheter over the needle and began to aspirate. 60 cc of blood drained into the syringe in the first 10 seconds. Dark blood. Blood that should have been flowing through his coronary arteries, not drowning his heart. She pulled back on the plunger and more came. Another 20 cc. Another 15. 40 seconds total. The monitor's waveform changed. The pressure had released. The chambers could beat again. Marcus's oxygen saturation climbed. 92. 95. 98. His blood pressure rose like a ship surfacing from the deep. 110/70. 120/80. The electrical rhythm on the monitor began to normalize, the jagged chaos becoming something almost beautiful in its regularity. Sinus rhythm. Normal. Alive. Danielle dropped the needle into the sharps container and stepped back. Her hands began to tremble now that it was over, the adrenaline leaving her system like water draining from a tub. Keisha was sobbing, pressing her hand through the rails to touch Marcus's arm. Patel stood motionless, staring at the monitor, then at Danielle, his face the color of old hospital walls. "How did you?" he started. "Where did you learn to do that?" Danielle didn't answer. She walked to the supply closet without a word, stepped inside, and slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold tile floor. The trembling intensified now. Not fear. Restraint. 20 years of restraint releasing in her hands like a pressure valve finally breaking. She pulled her knees to her chest and sat in the darkness of the supply closet, waiting for the world to remember that she was supposed to be nobody. Just a nurse. Just a nurse who couldn't save herself. 20 minutes later, Dr. Sterling arrived with Patricia Donovan and James Lim, 2 hospital board members he'd summoned at 2 in the morning with a single call, "We have a situation." They stood in the nurse's station reviewing charts with the expression of people hunting for evidence. Patel had documented the procedure in shaky handwriting: pericardiocentesis performed by nursing staff, authorization unclear, procedure successful, patient stabilized. Sterling's face reddened as he read. This wasn't a protocol violation. This was a usurpation. This was a nurse performing a procedure that belonged exclusively to physicians. This was his authority being questioned in the most public way possible. He found Danielle in the break room at 4 in the morning, still in her scrubs, still wearing the stethoscope that marked her as someone who was supposed to follow orders, not give them. You performed an invasive surgical procedure without physician authorization. Sterling's voice was quiet, which made it worse. The quiet of a man who no longer needed to raise his voice to be dangerous. That violates every protocol in this hospital. Danielle didn't stand. She looked up at him from the plastic chair, her eyes steady as water. The patient was in cardiac arrest, she said. Authorization is implicit. Authorization is explicit, Lim cut in, stepping forward with the termination letter already printed in his hand. And we discovered something else, Ms. Ross. Your employment application. You left the military service field entirely blank. The question wasn't do you have military training, it was list all prior service. Omitting that is falsification of your employment history. Danielle took a measured breath. Her voice was still calm, still flat. I left it blank. That's not a lie. Omission is deception, Sterling said. He nodded to Lim. You're terminated for cause. Security is waiting. You'll surrender your hospital ID, your access badge, and any hospital property in your possession. You have 10 minutes to collect your personal items. The words landed like grenades, but Danielle's face didn't change. The trembling in her hands had stopped. In its place was the flat effect of someone who'd already survived the worst the world had to offer. By 6 in the morning, 2 security guards escorted her out through the ER bay. The morning shift was just arriving, nurses and residents and attendings, all of them stopping mid-stride as they watched Danielle Ross, the quiet one, the invisible one, the one who'd made everyone coffee and never complained, walk out carrying a small cardboard box. Inside it, her stethoscope. A photograph of her 16-year-old son Caleb. The worn combat boots from her locker, leather-creased and faded from 20 years of walking across deserts that didn't forgive forgetting. Nobody spoke. Nobody stopped her. Jennifer Park, the nurse who'd laughed at Danielle's expense in the break room just yesterday, watched from the medication station with her hand over her mouth. She'd seen what Danielle had done. She'd heard the command in her voice. And now she was watching her get carried out like trash. That evening, the rain came down on Houston like the sky was breaking. Danielle drove to the cemetery on the east side, the one where the headstones were still new enough that the names hadn't weathered to illegibility. She parked her truck in the empty lot and walked to the grave marked with her husband's name, Staff Sergeant David Ross. Died September 14, 2012. She knelt in the grass, cold and soaked and unforgiving, and pressed her forehead against the stone. I tried to just be normal, she whispered. The rain hammered down, filling the gaps between the headstones. Just be quiet. Just disappear like you said I should. Lightning flickered across the clouds. But I failed him, David. I failed that boy again. And now they've taken even this from me. Her shoulders shook. Not from the cold. From 20 years of carrying weight that wasn't supposed to have a name. She'd saved Marcus Webb twice now, once in the rubble of Tikrit with his blood on her hands, once in a Houston hospital with a needle moving through the dark. And both times, the world had made her pay for it. She stayed there until the lightning moved farther away, then drove home through the rain to the empty house where her 16-year-old son was asleep upstairs, unaware that his mother had just become unemployed, unaware of what his mother actually was. At 2 in the morning, Caleb Ross couldn't sleep either. He'd been in his mother's closet earlier looking for his winter jacket when his arm brushed against something in the attic access panel. A shadow box. He pulled it down carefully, already knowing by its weight that it contained something significant. He opened it in his room with the door closed, the hallway light spilling in just enough to see. Medals. 5 of them arranged on burgundy felt. Each one glinting like a promise. The nameplate below them read in engraved brass, Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, United States Navy Special Warfare. Caleb's hands trembled as he held the box. His mother cleaned houses for insurance companies. His mother made soup from scratch on Sundays. His mother was quiet and kind and invisible. His mother was not a senior chief. His mother was not in special warfare. His mother was not the person he thought she was. He set the box carefully on his desk and stared at it until dawn broke through his window, unable to look away, unable to make sense of what the metal and ribbon were telling him. That evening, rain hammered the cemetery like 1,000 accusations. Danielle knelt on grass that had gone soft and cold beneath her knees, the kind of ground that remembers everything, every footfall, every tear, every moment someone tried to disappear into it. She'd driven straight from the hospital, still wearing scrubs that smelled of antiseptic and failure. Her husband's grave sat 3 rows back, the granite headstone catching what little light the storm allowed. She pressed her palm against his name and whispered into the downpour. "I tried to just be normal. Just be quiet. Just disappear like you said I should." Her voice cracked, but only once. She swallowed it back down. "But I failed him. I failed that boy again. And now they've taken even this from me." The rain didn't answer. The grass didn't answer. Nothing answered because she'd spent 20 years making sure nothing would have to. She'd buried the uniform. She'd buried the medals. She'd buried the part of herself that had pulled a terrified 8-year-old from rubble while Tikrit burned around her, and she'd promised herself that boy would survive because at least one life would make the rest of it mean something. She'd kept that promise. She'd kept it twice. And it had cost her everything. By the time she drove home, her clothes were soaked through. Caleb was asleep, or pretending to be. She could hear him breathing in the dark of his room as she passed. She showered until the water ran cold, then stood in front of the bathroom mirror for 7 minutes without moving, watching a stranger in a medical uniform stare back. The next morning, Caleb walked into Oak Creek Memorial's administrative office carrying something that made every muscle in Danielle's body seize if she'd been there to see it. But she wasn't. She was home, staring at a termination letter that used words like unauthorized and falsified and immediate cessation. Caleb was 16, still in his school uniform, moving with the quiet determination of a child who'd just discovered that his entire life had been built on a carefully constructed lie. CEO Margaret Vance was reviewing quarterly reports when the knock came. Caleb stood in her doorway holding a shadow box like it was the most fragile and important thing in the world. "My mom was fired yesterday. You need to see these." Margaret's office fell silent except for the rain against the windows. Caleb stepped forward and opened the box. Inside, arranged with military precision, were medals suspended from ribbons that had faded to the colors of old blood and old sky. His voice was steady, but it cracked at the edges like thin ice. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. He read the engraving slowly, running his finger across each letter. That's who she is. The accompanying file was thick. A trembling nurse named Jennifer Park, the same one who'd laughed at Danielle's expense in the break room 3 days earlier, took the papers with shaking hands and began to read aloud. Medical evacuations under fire. Classified operations across 3 deployments. Citations for valor under circumstances the file itself was too restricted to fully describe. Emergency procedures conducted in conditions that made the pericardiocentesis look like child's play. The room felt smaller. The air pressure changed. That was the moment a man in a dress uniform walked through the door. Commander James Harrison, active duty SEAL team leader, in Houston for a conference, had been visiting Marcus Webb when he heard the commotion in the hallway. He'd excused himself from the patient room, followed the sound of Margaret's voice rising in shock, and stepped into the CEO's office to find a boy holding military medals and the institutional machinery of Oak Creek Memorial grinding to a halt. His face went pale. "No." He said it like a prayer. Like a question. Like 20 years of searching had just suddenly ended in a room that smelled like corporate air freshener and leather furniture. He stepped forward and looked at the medals in the box. His hand moved from one to the next, reading the ribbons like a fluent language. Bronze star with Valor. He stopped. Breathed. Silver star. 2 purple hearts. His voice dropped another octave. And a Navy Cross. The silence that followed was so dense you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electric song above everyone's heads. She pulled my entire unit out of an ambush in 2004. Harrison's words came slowly, each one weighted like a sandbag. 14 lives. Including that deaf kid, Marcus Webb. I looked for her for years. We all did. She disappeared like she was a ghost, and we couldn't. He stopped. Swallowed. She saved us. She saved all of us. Margaret Vance's face had gone the color of hospital walls. Jennifer Park was openly crying. And in that moment, before the board members could formulate their responses or before Margaret could begin processing what this meant for the institution, another voice cut through the static of the room's shock. You want to know about unauthorized procedures? IT specialist Martin Torres stood in the doorway, and in his hand was a laptop already connected to the CEO's wall display. Torres was a Marine, had been for 8 years, and he had the particular stillness of someone who knew how to move through the world without making a sound. I work night security backup. I was in the system at 3:17 a.m. pulling logs. The display flickered to life. When you delete something from our hospital servers, it doesn't go away. We have shadow backups. Everything is logged with a timestamp and user ID. The footage played. Dr. Sterling at the security office terminal. His hands entering his admin credentials. His face, absolutely calm, absolutely methodical, as he selected footage from Marcus Webb's room. The hallway confrontation with Danielle. Delete. 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 He didn't know we had redundancy protocols, Torres said quietly. I pulled the backups. Filed a report with Houston PD and the medical board at 6 a.m. Security arrived within 12 minutes. Margaret Vance didn't make the call to escort Sterling out. He was already waiting in his office, surrounded by the careful architecture of his professional life. The diplomas on his wall. The photographs with city councilmen and hospital benefactors. The plaques commemorating his tenure. When they walked him past the ER, through the corridor where nurses suddenly stopped moving, where residents fell silent, where the pericardiocentesis that saved Marcus Webb's life had reverberated like a sonic boom through everyone's assumptions, staff watched like people watching a building collapse in slow motion. A resident whispered, "What happened?" Jennifer Park, her voice carrying across the space with the weight of terrible knowledge, said, "He fired a Navy Cross recipient for saving a patient." Then tried to delete the proof. In the ER proper, Marcus Webb sat in a wheelchair that his wife Keisha pushed with steady hands. His hearing aids were off, he read lips now, had learned that skill decades ago, but when security escorted Sterling past the open doorway, Marcus's eyes caught the movement. He watched the man who'd spoken cruelty pass, and he signed something to Keisha with movements sharp enough to cut. Keisha translated for the nurses nearby, "That's the doctor? The one who hurt the nurse who saved me." Harrison nodded. He was still in the hallway, still in dress uniform, still processing the architecture of the last 20 years collapsing into coherence. Marcus signed again, slower this time. "I remember her now," Keisha said, and her own voice broke slightly. "He says she was there when the building came down in Iraq. She pulled him out of the rubble when he was 8. He's looked for her his whole life. Now she saved him again, and this man tried to destroy her for it." The hallway had gone completely silent. Even the machines seemed to have stopped beeping. By afternoon, the Texas Medical Board had opened a formal investigation. The nursing board dropped its inquiry into Danielle and opened one into Sterling for filing a false complaint against a protected military veteran. His attempts to call in favors fell into a void. Board members he'd cultivated suddenly took calls about emerging conflicts of interest, and Patricia Donovan, the board member who'd enabled his investigation, sent word through her attorney that she would not be taking calls. Sterling sat alone in his apartment, watching his career disintegrate in real time. The emergency suspension of his medical license came via certified mail. His lawyer called at 3:38 p.m. with news that got progressively worse: evidence tampering, wrongful termination of a protected veteran, filing false reports. 3 separate felonies were being considered by the DA's office. He'd built his entire life on institutional momentum, on the knowledge that once you were inside the system protected its own. He'd never considered what happened when the system decided you were no longer one of its own. He swept his framed diplomas off the wall in a moment of fury that felt like the only honest thing he'd done in years. Glass shattered across the hardwood floor, and he watched the pieces scatter like they were the fragments of someone else's life. 6 months later, the morning sun cut through the ER windows at Oak Creek Memorial and found Danielle Ross standing at a podium in dress uniform for the first time in 15 years. The worn combat boots sat in a glass display case behind her, lit with the kind of museum lighting usually reserved for things that mattered historically. Below them, a brass plaque read, "Courage doesn't announce itself, it simply shows up when needed." Caleb sat in the front row, tears streaming down his face, his father's flag folded in his lap alongside the shadow box that was no longer hidden. The boots his mother had worn through 3 wars, through Tikrit and through Houston, were finally being seen. CEO Margaret Vance spoke first, her voice steady in a way that suggested she'd rehearsed this apology 1,000 times in the mirror. She announced new hospital-wide training on veteran recognition. A scholarship fund in Danielle's name, starting with $50,000. An institutional commitment that would never again let someone like Marcus Webb be seen as just another ER admission. Commander Harrison presented her with a flag that had been flown over SEAL Team headquarters. He saluted her, a full, slow salute, fist to chest, and said simply, "Welcome home, Senior Chief." Marcus Webb signed his speech from where he stood beside the podium, Keisha translating his words for the audience. "This woman saved my life twice. Once when I was a child who didn't understand war. Once when I was a man who'd forgotten miracles. She asked for nothing. She is the definition of service." The applause was the kind of sound that fills a room like water filling a glass, from the bottom up, inevitable and thorough. Across town, in a shopping plaza between a tax prep service and a vape shop, Dr. Marcus Sterling sat at a folding card table with a sign that read "low-cost insurance quotes." His medical license was permanently revoked. His law degree in jeopardy. The luxury apartment sublet to someone else. His entire carefully constructed architecture of status had collapsed into this, a folding table, a stack of brochures, and the mathematical certainty that he would never recover. A passerby dropped a brochure on his table without stopping. Sterling straightened it with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and stared at the rain gathering on the asphalt. At the ceremony, Danielle's closing words carried through the ER like a benediction. "I spent 20 years hiding because I thought my value was in what I could forget. But healing doesn't come from silence. It comes from showing up. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need to stand up when someone needs you, even when it costs you everything." The audience rose. 200 people standing. Nurses who'd shunned her now weeping openly. Residents and attendings who'd never questioned Sterling's version of events now understanding what they'd allowed. And Marcus Webb, signing with movements that needed no translation, "Thank you, Guardian." Danielle signed back, her hands moving through shapes she hadn't shaped in 20 years. "You're welcome, little brother." That evening, Caleb hung the shadow box on the living room wall beside his father's flag and photograph. The boots gleamed behind museum glass, preserved now not as something to hide but as something to remember. And Danielle, for the first time in 20 years, slept through the entire night without waking to sounds that existed only in the architecture of her own survival. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated or judged by someone who didn't know your true value, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to know that quiet strength often carries the heaviest weight. Leave a comment. Have you ever discovered that someone in your life was carrying a burden nobody knew about? Your stories matter. Thank you for watching.